Alright, today we're going to address analog warmth. I'm going to try to make this video as short as possible and as simple as possible so that you can understand the concepts and the complexities that can be built from them and some direction to search in to further your knowledge if you want to dig into it. It's a very complex issue and it's going to be going on for a long time because you are dealing with sound that can be very complex, and very small alterations of the sound can change an entire mix. So distortion and saturation and noise are a huge issue to deal with. Now, when we're talking about analog warmth, the first thing I want to tell you is I suggest you go back and watch these videos. The equal loudness contour here, basic principles, complex polar waveforms, noise and distortion, sound sculpting. There's a series here on sound sculpting explaining harmonics, timbre, harmonic distortion. There's another one here on spectral content shaping that you should really look at and be familiar with. There's another couple here on saturation, shaping your saturations with noise and distortion. Those are huge. You will find in the spectral content shaping ones, I actually did some automation of actually following an actual track around with automation on the EQ work, which can be huge as far as dealing with issues you're having. So that's my first recommendation. The second thing we're going to talk about is direct analog warmth. What are we dealing with? Okay, analog warmth. You're talking about noise, first of all. You pick up a seashell and you stick it to your ear. People say you hear the ocean. Well, you don't. You hear white noise, okay? White noise is everywhere, all right? It just is. And without negative electrons bouncing around the circuit, it stays fairly white. And as soon as negative electrons start bouncing around, you'll get like a pink noise. And sometimes that can really depend on what all is going on in the circuitry, that can evolve into all kinds of different types of noises. So we will get to that, but just understand that. The second thing to understand about noise is its full spectrum. If you look at noise, it's all the way across the spectrum. So anytime you add noise, it's boosting because of multiplication. It's both boosting, like this is a vocal track. So anytime you start boosting up any type of noise there, that it's going to start boosting the harmonics, the sideband distortion, and the noise inherent in the track. So that's going to be adding warmth to it. And distortion would basically look at it as noise, but it's added a type of a warmth to it. It's distorting it. And that's one way to deal with it. The other thing is harmonics. Now, real quick, we'll look at noise really fast in the studio. That when you're looking at like noise, you go on the internet and download all kinds of noises: blue noise, brown, red noise, gray noise, white noise, pink noise. And, you know, all these different types of noises that all have different characteristics. And if you got like brown noise on here, and you can see what it kind of looks like, just like the waveform, and you can throw it on a spectrogram and see what it looks like on a spectrogram. And here's like blue noise, right? Well, you can see immediately the differences in it and what it might do if you put it behind a mix, or if you put it behind a single track, what that might do to the mix as you bring it up underneath there. And as you go along, you might make a totally separate track underneath the entire mix and then use automation on it to follow the dynamics of the song so that it stays fairly flowing with the dynamics. And that's a huge tool. And it adds some color. And it's what a lot of people talk about glue, that either on a track to soften up a vocal or to give it a little more flavor or a little more zang to it, you know, a little bit of noise, a harsh noise or a really soft noise. They're going to do different things to that and the mix. So, you know, and EQing the noise. Sometimes I'll take the noise and I'll actually throw an EQ on there and EQ the noise so that it's, you know, more complementary to the mix, the noise itself, and then start blending it into it. So that can be very complex. You have to understand that, you know, that it's a complex issue, and that's the reason why a lot of people, there's so many different ways to look at what analog equipment would be cool, what microphone would be good, because of the different characteristics of just plain noise that it might add into it, and the frequency response of that noise added with whatever is happening in the vocal, in the capture. Does that make sense? So, and that's one way to deal with it, you know, and it's a very surgical way to deal with it. Adding noise from actual files to the actual individual tracks and blending them, or to the whole mix. Just be very careful, it doesn't take much. Now the second thing we're talking about is distortion. When you're talking about distortion, the first type of distortion you're dealing with is a soft clipping, a hard clipping, which is going to be working out some, you know, depending on what it's doing with the slope and the type of clipping it is going to work out somewhere along the lines of a square wave, something, you know, similar to a square wave or a straight up square wave. And it's going to be adding these harmonic contents to it. Now you have to understand that as you blend this into it, that it's going to start boosting, like you've got this fifth here, it's going to be boosting that fifth from mathematically, from math, that it's going to be adding them together, multiplication. So they have to understand it's going to do that all the way across the spectrum. It's going to be boosting those harmonics. The other one, and that basically most of the time works out to overdriving the amperage capabilities of a circuit. Now, if you're talking about overdriving the speed capabilities of a circuit, a lot of time you'd be dealing with like a ramp wave or something like that, which has a really nice soft tone. It's like, for like violins and stuff like that, it's got a lot of warmth behind it. So if you can emulate that ramp saw wave that's following that and using it as a distortion, it can really add some softness to the actual overall mix, some really nice saturation in there, or like a triangle wave. So you have to understand that, and what it's going to do, it's going to boost those main harmonics that it's working against. And one thing to understand about that is that it's really difficult because you don't know what it's working on. You've got a full mix. Let's say you got a full mix and you're trying to add that saturation or that distortion. Well, what is it working off? It'll saturate from what is the root. So this root's going to be here, and you got a full mix that these instruments might be on different root notes that it's trying to distort, trying to find what root to start the distortion from. Correct? Because you see that the distortion has a fundamental root note, and when it tries to distort that, it's going to start on the fundamental. So you got to really kind of be careful of that. And the other thing to understand, and one thing about that, when you're dealing with the distortion, there's lots of saturation plugins out there, and look at them, see what they're doing to a very nice clean file. And you can get things like, here's Wave Shaper CM, and you'll see that on the videos, a free plugin for doing some shaping and adding some distortion. Isotope Trash 2 is another one that you can do some really cool things for adding even an odd harmonics to the distortion. Hornell Graphic, this is a free one that added some I was really surprised that it added some really cool even and odd harmonics, just slightly, there's lots of plugins out there. Or nowadays they have these things like console shaper emulations. This one's in Studio One, but it's adding some drive, some noise, and crosstalk, that's actually going to add it in to the mix. And on certain tracks or certain groups of tracks you've done, and they can get very complicated, but the basic concept is very simple when you're dealing with that analog warmth, that those are the things that you'd be adding into it. And when you start breaking it down, the simple concept to get through your head so you don't get lost in it is get as clean a capture as possible. That means don't worry about having some piece of equipment to get such a certain analog warmth. Worry about getting as clean a capture as possible. Then when you start mixing in with the rest of the mix, is it working well with that? If it's not, and it's having some issues, and you start having to EQ it, low cut, high cut filters on it, maybe a little bit of slight EQ work on it, and then you might want to start adding some type of noise to it, and a little bit of saturation, and maybe a little bit of harmonic content, even or odd harmonics, to boost something to get it going. But wait until you start mixing it, and then you can see what kind of warmth it might need. I mean, when we try to look at it as analog warmth, which most of the time that was what was in question when I started making this video, that's what you're talking about. So what does it need? Then you can start addressing, does that good clean capture sound really good now? Or I need to do some work on it? Start with EQ work, and then after you get done doing some EQ work, then you want to add some noise to it. Some nice brown noise that's really soft, you know. I mean, you want to add some of that to it, maybe EQ it a little bit, and then bring it up underneath it and start boosting in there a little bit to try to boost some of the sideband distortion or something, you know, and the harmonics a little bit, and add just a little bit of noise in there. You know, those kind of, what type of a noise? That you take some time messing with. And then talking about saturation distortion, you approach it the same way. What's going to add a little bit to it once it starts mixing? Because once you start getting that full mix together, if you go back and watch that video series on spectral content shaping when you're working through the mix, then it's going to become real apparent if it needs some work like that. And also there's a whole section in that video series about automating your EQ work, meaning you've got this root and this lady's singing and the root notes moving all over the place, right? So that, and you've sat down and figured out where the root note is, and you've done your EQ work on her vocal, you know, what harmonics should be boosted or attenuated, and then you automate it so it moves around and follows the root note. And that's a really cool thing. Once you get that down, it actually is really nice, but it takes some time and it takes some work. But anyway, that is what I'm trying to address, and it's that simple. Try to keep it that simple in your head, and when you're dealing with it, you will find a lot of times that very little goes a long ways. And be real careful. You got a full mix and you start trying to add noise to it, or distortion or saturation or harmonic content, then it's affecting that whole mix, and it probably not going to take very much at all. It's hardly even noticeable. It's like you've put so little amount of it on there that you've squished down that noise waveform to where you can't even see it anymore. And it's like, well, dude, I don't hear it. No, well, trust me, you know, just you have to step away and come back and listen to it to hear the difference, because it's doing something to it, and it normally doesn't take much. People will be messing around with it and adding a bunch to it, and then they don't like it, and then be getting, and it's like, it just a little bit. If you can start to hear it, back off some from it, because it's probably too much, you know, and then step away for a little bit and come back and listen to it, you know, listen to it, compare them, you know, compare it with it and without it, then step away and come back when you're dealing with that analog warmth. And that goes where, I mean, here's a really good concept. Slate Digital, but the virtual microphones, they spent countless hours. People have like lockers full of microphones. I mean, how many people can go out and buy all those microphones for their studio? I mean, I wouldn't, but I mean, you know, I mean, the answer is that's a lot of money, and it might not work. You sit there and try all these different microphones on this individual, when these are the concepts that you basically need to address after you get a good, clean capture. After you get a good, clean capture and you'd be like, well, it sounds a little harsh or da-da-da-da-da, let's start mixing it and see what happens. I know, okay, it's mixed in the mix a little bit, and I'm starting to work up the da-da-da-da-da-da. I've done a little compression on it or something, you know, because I'm getting some spikes or something. Worry about the performance and the capture, and then start working with it with these concepts. Once you start mixing it together to see what it might need. It might not need nothing. You might need to do a little high cut, a little low cut, and you might add a little bit of noise to it. You might find this vocalist and you're like, it's this cool jazz song, and I've had a little bit of brown noise behind her and brought it up a little bit and did a little bit of automation so it's following her vocals, and it just sounds awesome, dude. You know, and you got, you know, this other lady or this guy comes in, he's doing this rock stuff, and it's, you end up add a little bit of harmonic content with something like, you know, Isotope Trash 2 or the Wave Shaper or some other plugin like that. Or you might use the Console Shaper to add a little bit of drive and some noise and some crosstalk that might be doing something with it. That can get very complex, but that's the simple way to look at it. That way, when you're looking and somebody starts talking about analog warmth, steer clear of it. Back in the day, they didn't have no choice. 50 years ago, you couldn't pull out your DAW and all this stuff, you know, and start messing around with what was going on. You had to deal with what you had. Nowadays, we got technology that we can be very, very surgical about dealing with harmonic content, noise, saturation, and you know, harmonic noise, harmonic distortion. We can be very surgical about it, but we just take our time and wait until we get into the mix to see what really needs to happen to that vocal. It's got a good clean capture. What do I, now that it's in the mix and I'm starting to get it kind of worked out, what does it sound like it needs? What kind of EQ work does it need? Does it need a little bit of noise behind it? Would that help it? Approach it very surgically. So that's very simple concept to understand, and I hope I made that really clear so that you can deal with that in a real simple way and not get so lost in it. And just remember, a little goes a long ways, and be real careful, because if you start messing with one track and then you start mixing in with a bunch of other tracks you did all this work on, it multiplies. Every little bit of noise you put noise on this vocal track, you put some harmonic work on this vocal track. Now you start mixing in with other tracks that you have done the same type of work in. It's going to multiply. Just like reverberation, you got to be careful of the reverberation. It multiplies all the crap. So any crap that you didn't want, it's going to get multiplied. So be very surgical about it and really think about every time you're going to add it to it. A lot of times you'll find out you don't. A lot of times you might find out you might add just a little bit of noise to the whole mix to kind of glue it together. A nice brown noise or a little bit of blue noise to brighten it up a little bit. And you might even EQ the noise a little bit before you bring it up under it. And you might put in something in there like trash too to just add a little bit, or a console wave shaper just to dirty it up just a little bit, you know, and, you know, or a certain group of tracks, you know, something like that. And try to keep it very simple. And the other thing, if you really want to get into it and you want to get in deep to it, that you can get something like MATLAB. And MATLAB has this thing here. It's a model builder. And you can actually build models for analyzing and working with audio. And you can build modules that are going to add, you know, odd harmonics and even harmonics, sin and cos multiplied by your audio file, that are going to add even and odd harmonics to it. And or you can actually get in there and do trigonomic functions that are going to add all kinds of distortions to your files. Does that make sense? And to what's going on with them. And polynomial functions and linear equations, or actual MATLAB functions. You can actually create a function to actually figure out what's going on there and add it very surgically. So if you really get that in-depth in it, you can buy yourself MATLAB and have some fun, bro. I've had a blast in it because I learned so much on it. It was just like, whoa, bro, I didn't know that would do that. That trigonomic function will do that. And, you know, try not to get, I mean, you don't have to become Einstein with math. Sometimes I've gotten a little lost in it. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I have a breadboard full of numbers. And oh, bro, wait a minute. You know, so be careful, but a lot of it isn't, you can work with a lot of stuff without getting too lost in the math. And that's a real simple outline of how to deal with that and how you can deal with that. And hopefully that now when you hear about analog warmth and things like that, that you approach it. And don't be surprised that you can't buy some distortion plug-in that you got in your DAW and throw it on there and get good, you know, saturation. You know, I mean, it might not work as well as you thought. You might have to get something that's a little bit more fine-tuned to deal with distortion. You know, something like the Wave Shaper, the Isotope Trash 2, or the Horneograph. I mean, there's lots of plugins, but dealing with those type of distortions and being as surgical as you can with it, I'll tell you that. I'll be real honest with you. When I first started messing with it, I figured out that it was huge in working with audio. And then I figured out how little it takes most of the time to do something you want to do. And I figured out that another thing I figured out that is after doing some surgical EQ work, I found out a lot of times that I could do it with the EQ and not worry about adding some type of distortion. Does that make sense? Noise was a different thing. A noise is a really good glue. It just is. And it can really warm up a vocal. I mean, I had this lady and she had this voice and it sounded really good, really lilting, and but there was just something I couldn't get it right. And I put some brown noise on it and I EQ'd it to where I boosted the low end a little bit and I dropped the high end just a little bit on that noise file, ran all the way into the track underneath her vocal, and then I slowly blended into her vocal, and it just made her sound like liquid flowing chocolate, bro. I mean, she sounded awesome. So that, I mean, and that just takes some experimentation, and that's, if you love audio, then you know that it's amazing what you're able to do nowadays as compared to what you were able to do. So be real careful when you're talking to some old school people about analog warmth, that, you know, they may not throw you in that direction because they've been doing it for years, they're not going there. You know, and you might want to, because, you know, and you definitely do want to try to approach that analog warmth and that whole issue as best you can, like I'm trying to explain to you, and dig into it a little bit. After watching those videos I showed you, you might branch out and really find out some other cool things that can really be helpful in you working with that. But I certainly hope that cleared up the analog warmth thing for you so you don't get confused by that. And just remember, a little goes a long ways. And wait until you're getting into the mix and see how it's blending and what you might have to do to it then. And just remember, go light. Peace, hope, love. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.